Hello, everyone. Welcome to FP Chatter. Tonight, we will once again be exploring the wonderful world of podcasting with Chuck and Sachin. Our theme for tonight is news and the art of storytelling. One second. Okay. Chuck, who's you may see him as Deepak on the name, but he prefers to go by Chuck. He's a marketing professional who has also tried his hand at stand-up comedy, cartooning, and writing. His podcast Simblified is a humor meets education show nearing 100 episodes. Welcome, Chuck, to FP Chatter. Tell us a little more about yourself and why the name Simplified.
Hey guys. I think that pretty much summed up everything that I've tried to do, and the emphasis on the word try really just keeps jumping from one thing to the other. Uh, I've been running this podcast called Simplified for a while. I'll get into a little bit of detail on that in a bit. I also run a satire newsletter with a friend every Saturday and Sunday, or Sunday actually. I work as a marketing professional for Insider.in, which is an events ticketing company based out of Mumbai. And I just uh, love podcasts actually. So I think I should just start with that. I got into podcasts and I started listening to podcasts back in 2015, 16 or so. Bless whoever sneezed. I and at the time it was interesting. There weren't any Indian podcasts around, and a friend of mine whose blog, I mean, we Narendra Shenoy, we followed each other's blogs back in the day when blogs was still a thing, and then we got together and said, hey, why don't we start a podcast and let's, you know. One big idea that we had in our head was, breaking down complex things that happen in the news and
Hmm.
using humor and jokes and puns and things like that. And when I say humor, I have to emphasize that a large part of that is attempted humor. And Naren and I are not comedians by any stretch of imagination. Uh, the show started back in 2015, and we basically just pinballed our way into various things, and finally, the good folks at IVM Podcast, which is India's largest podcast production company, they for some reason signed us on, and we went to better. We joked that we. We got better mics and studio space, and we used to say that before we were signed by IVM, our idea of audio production was switching off the fan. So I think we just did a step up from there. I think IVM's also been responsible for a big part of our distribution and suggesting ideas and just making sure that we keep coming to the studio to record. If my producer Abbas is listening to this, we are the reason he has sleepless nights basically. Um, without rambling too much, by the name Simplified, we basically just wanted to simplify the news, and both of us are South Indians, so the P became a B in true Mallu fashion. So Simplified became Simplified, and yeah, that's pretty much it. There's no deeper meaning to that, really. Yeah.
Sorry. Next, we have Sachin with us, who is a writer and has six best-selling novels to his credit. He has a YouTube channel called Stories with a Message, and in 2016, he started a podcast, Indian Grapevine. He's also the founder of a publishing house called Grapevine India. Welcome, Sachin, to FB Chatter. Tell us more about yourself and why the shift from podcasting to YouTube.
Thank you so much, Suchita. Great to be here. And I was introduced to podcast around sometime around 2015 when I came across this podcast, which was based on book publishing. And because I'm an author myself, and because I also run a book publishing company, so I was curious about the topic and I started listening. And the podcast had around 100 episodes, which were 1 hour each. And I mean, all of us binge watch Netflix, but I just binge listened to that podcast
Been
in
there,
less than
done
a
that.
month. Yeah, 100 hours of audio. I think I must have finished it in less than 20, 25 days.
Wow.
Uh, But in the process, what happened was that I discovered this world of podcasting.
Yeah.
And what I believe is that oral storytelling as a tradition is really old in India.
Yeah.
And among several traditions that I think we've kind of slowed down on as a culture, I think oral storytelling is a concept which is really being left behind in our country. I believe that
Hmm.
there are some people like Nilesh Misra who are doing great work, but I believe podcasting, especially in India, is still quite nascent. But
Hmm.
in the years to come, I think it is definitely on the verge of booming in next 3 4 years.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So before we begin and before we get into the questions, I just want to tell all our viewers that we will be taking live questions. So if you have any questions, any queries, or just want to make a comment, then don't hesitate to put them in the comments below, and we will put them up on the screen and we'll definitely take them up. So my first question is for Sachin. You have explored writing on different mediums. You have written novels, scripts, plays, videos as well. So how does storytelling differ in those mediums when compared to podcasts?
See, what I feel is that podcasting is a very intimate medium. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
like I listen to podcasts on my phone,
Yeah.
and I combine my 2 hours of listening every day with my morning walk or evening walk, post dinner walk or something. So the act of somebody whispering some story or some knowledge in my ear, I feel that whole exercise is a very intimate exercise. Okay, I feel
Mm-hmm.
like for example, when I binge listen to 100 hours of content, I felt like
Yeah.
I had a friend. I had two more friends in the industry who were giving me knowledge, who were like my mentors, and as they talked about, like when they were talking about book publishing, they would also talk about that I now have a daughter and sometimes their dog will walk in. I felt like I knew them really well.
Yeah.
Okay. So the thing about storytelling and podcast is that the kind of relationship that you build with your listener is
Yeah.
extremely intimate. You build a connection, and you have your listeners' full attention when they're listening to the story
Yeah.
that you're telling.
Yeah.
So in that way, I believe that podcasting is a completely different medium from say books or movies. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and I think I'm still a beginner. I still have a lot to learn, and in the coming weeks, I'm sure that I will discover several other aspects of it as well.
Yeah, I like what you said about that you have to listen and pay attention, because I think when we have a visual and an audio working together, we sometimes do tend to forget the video or the audio
Yeah,
because we're like, we'll catch up with the other thing.
yeah, yeah.
But if you're
So
just listening, then yeah, you do have to pay attention, because if you miss something, then you won't really get a chance to, sort of get what you
So one thing,
missed.
so one thing I noticed was that when I started my first audio podcast in 2016,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of my audience came from my books. They were people who had read my books, and
Mm-hmm.
they were introduced to the concept of audio podcast when I introduced my first episode. So
Oh,
because of that, what happened was that a lot of them listened to the podcast on their laptops. Okay,
yeah.
and they stopped everything and sat in front of the laptop and listened to the podcast. And
Yeah.
I did get some reaction that it's a bit weird that I'm sitting in my front of my laptop and I don't
Yeah.
have anything to look at,
Thing to
and I'm
look
just,
at. Yeah.
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 So I kind of told them that it's something which it was better on phone, and
Yeah.
you can maybe combine it with a walk or something like that.
Yeah.
So, which is, I think, it's a slow process, and the culture will build with some time in years to come.
Yeah, I have to
Yeah.
agree.
Chuck, would you like to add something?
Yeah, actually, both of you guys mentioned something very interesting. Sachin, you said that it felt like a very intimate medium, and I have to
Yeah.
agree. Like in all the years I've been listening to podcasts and doing podcasts and speaking to other people who produce or do their own podcasts, I think this is the one word that comes out very strongly. It's a very
Yes.
intimate medium.
Yeah.
I think
Hmm.
I think the nicest thing anyone has said about our show is that it feels like two friends are in the room and we are drinking single malt and discussing things together. I think that was, I think, I mean, that is such a nice thing to say, and that's the type of vibe that we have tried to give off on our show as well. And something that you said also was very interesting, that you don't have the clutter of visual in your
Yeah.
head, right? You are, in a way, making up your own image of the host talking to you, or you. I mean, there are so many shows that I've heard. I mean, probably hundreds of episodes of I have no idea what the hosts look like, and
Hmm.
or what they're doing or what their mannerisms are, and you build up all these in your own in your mind. It's in a way, it's like. How we used to romanticize cricket commentary back in the day before. I mean, right now cricket is this multi-visual spectacle that's,
Yeah.
music, commentary, dance, everything apart from the sport itself. But back in the day, you used to have a faceless commentator describing faceless cricketers, and you built up your own image. Obviously, not our generation, but you'd hear
Yeah.
stories of how they would be on the radio. And I'm not sure, and I honestly do not think that that's because of a lack of evolution. Like, what we do can very easily be translated into a video medium as well. It's just that I think, and I think Sachin will agree with me here, is that just the pure audio medium does have its advantages, and
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's something very, very powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Chuck, you use humor and satire to talk about news and to educate people. What are the pointers you keep in mind while podcasting news using these two tools, and how important or useful are these tools of humor and satire in delivering news?
Okay, I think there are multiple parts to the question that you just asked. Firstly, I think it's important to keep in mind that Simplified, while it started off wanting to simplify the news as such, it evolved or devolved, depending on your point of view, into something that actually just takes any complex thing that happens around us. So while we started off with the news, because there were a couple of things at that point of time that were very meaty. Like, I think the first episode we ever did was the Greek economic crisis. And then
Ah.
after that, it was the whole IPL betting scandal that happened after that.
Hmm.
But then
Hmm.
after that, we fell short of these huge, big topics to talk about. And, there were a lot of things that we didn't want to talk about either. Like, we didn't want to get into politics too much at that point of time.
Yeah.
So then it evolved into other things that we can talk about as well. We started getting guests on the show. We just started having um random topics that everybody is curious about and talking about those as well. So I would say we have moved away slightly from talking about news as such, and just talking about everything. That being said, we still try to be as topical as possible. We spoke about the Brexit, the Russian meddling in the U.S. elections, lots and lots of things actually, which are fairly topical. But coming back to your
Yes.
question, which is about humor and satire, I think this is extremely, extremely important. Two reasons I can think of off the top of my head. One, a lot of the news that we have today, let's face it, is not extremely cheerful.
Yeah.
Without getting into things too much, because I know all three of us want to be alive at the end of this podcast. Uh, I think the world is going through. I think the world could use humor right now. It's
Yeah.
not a very happy time to be a citizen of the planet, and in a way that's interesting because culture has always reacted uh, uh, to bad moments. Like, if you
Hmm.
track the history of rock music, for instance, you'll see that it gets angrier as there are
Yeah.
precedents that the general population do not agree with. Grunge and heavy metal, for instance, grew when there was a lot of dissent against people. Like, on the other hand, in the Clinton years, it was more happy pop music because there weren't so many complaints as such. So I think so. While rock is one form of art, humor is another. Be in its various forms, be it stand-up comedy and be it today the sketches that these guys, AIB and everybody else is putting out, or be it a humble attempt at humor like ours. Um, I think it's extremely. I think humor is one way to swallow the bitter pill that is the news. Let me
Yeah.
put it that way. I think
Hmm.
that's one reason, and the second reason is that a lot of this is very complex. Like, if you ask the lay person on the street, they'll say, yeah, I mean, Russia did interfere in the US elections, but
Yeah.
they'll be hard pressed to tell you more about it. And that's also because the delivery of sad news happens in a sad format, because you don't expect news anchors to be very jovial and cheerful while talking about things like this. So that's why we try to make it slightly palatable in that sense, break it down into its bare bones using analogies, using jokes, using humor, using quotes, and things like that. I think those are the two reasons why we do what we do. I think those are the two reasons why humor and satire is important, or has always been important for delivering news, I think.
Sachin, would you like to add something to that?
I think great thoughts. See, humor is something that is definitely not my forte. Deepak, I have listened to his podcast all day today, and I think that he's doing a great job.
I'm
And
surprised you're still like standing.
uh, yeah, and a lot of very recurring feedback that I've got for my podcast is that why don't you make it funny? And I keep coming back to the word intimate, but I was trying to create a storytelling experience which listeners will find intimate.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
if humor, I mean, I'm like -10 if there was ever a humor scale. So yeah, so
Yeah,
humor
I
is
think.
some, yeah,
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 sorry,
go,
sorry,
yeah, go
I
on, go
cut
on,
you
go
off over
on,
there. Yeah,
go on.
I think that's interesting that you say that that's one of the feedback that you get, because if you look at the top podcasts in the world, there aren't too many comedy podcasts out there, and I'm not
Yeah,
Hmm.
saying that's because of a lack of comedy or people don't like funny content. I think the medium is extremely rich for a non-serious,
yeah,
non-funny type of podcast. Like some of my favorite podcasts, be it Freakonomics, the Tim Ferriss show, the way I heard it by Micro, none of these are funny or
yeah,
laugh
yeah.
out loud funny. In fact, yeah, go on.
Even I listened to around 30 odd podcasts,
Yeah.
and absolutely none of them are funny. Not even one of them are funny.
Yeah, I think,
Not even.
yeah,
Yeah,
a reason for that could possibly also be that comedians find it more worth their while to invest time in, YouTube or something like that. A classic example is AIB themselves. AIB was a podcast, an audio podcast first,
Yeah.
before they
yeah,
became a comedy collective, which then started
yeah,
making video sketches. And in a nice complete circle, they started making what they call video podcasts.
Yeah.
yeah,
So it's sort of like a full circle, really.
yeah. It's like a stepping stone in comedy
Yeah.
to other
Yeah.
things. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the next question is for both of you. While storytelling the podcast way, what are the aspects that you keep in mind generally? So
Oh,
So as
anyone?
a
Sachin,
so
I'm
yeah,
going to
so
let you
as
start with that one.
yeah, so two things come to my mind. One is that I'm usually a book writer. I write
Hmm.
books for a living, and
Yeah.
one liberty that books give you is that you have the liberty to go on multiple tangents at the same time.
Yeah.
Okay, you start from one angle and you develop it, and then you have the liberty of dropping it there and going on another tangent. Like for example, if we talk about Game of Thrones, okay, there
Hmm.
are 50 characters and each of them have their own story, each of them have their own
Story arcs.
backstory, they
Yeah.
have their own motives, they have their own family and universe and all of that. So I just think that in podcast, it works better if you follow one line, if you don't deviate too much, if you don't distract too much. And because I've tried several things, I also found that non-fiction works better than fiction. People
Oh,
prefer listening to, even if it is story, people prefer to listening to a true story. They prefer listening to real events. It could be because a big percentage of podcast audience is really learning oriented. There are people who really want
Yeah.
to learn new things. So it could be because of that, but I saw this really clear trend that people wanted to listen to non-fiction more than fiction.
very interesting. Very interesting. Chuck?
Yeah, I have to agree with that actually. I didn't think of that as a point, but now that I think about it, most of the podcasts that I listen to are actually non-fiction. It's pretty interesting. It's also because a lot of content tends to be topical. So
Hmm.
non-fiction also, a lot of non-fiction tends to tie back into that. Two things again that I think I keep in mind anyway when storytelling the podcast way. One, you have to be cognizant of the fact that you are that your listeners are going to be listening to you and not necessarily looking at you. Many times when you're public speaking or when you're doing stand-up comedy or something of that sort, you have the benefit of your gestures and facial expressions, etc., to add to what you're saying. You
Right.
do not have that over here. So whatever you're saying needs to be conveyed through the medium of just your voice, really. Actually, not just your voice, because you can also interject with a lot of audio effects and things like that. I think Freakonomics, for example, is a podcast that uses audio effects beautifully. It just rises the tension, breaks the tension. I think that that's something that's that's really cool. I think for me that's the way when we script our podcast, and that's the way we evolved. Initially, it was just us reading out a script as we would have written out on a blog, and eventually we realized, yeah, this needs to be tailored to people who are actually going to listen to you. And exactly what Sachin said, you can't keep them deviating too much, because
Yeah.
one thing also to keep in mind is, while podcasting is an intimate art, it's very likely that the person is doing something else while listening to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like they are likely to be at the gym, they are likely to be commuting, they are likely to be, just spring cleaning at home or something. So their attention, as much as we would like to flatter ourselves thinking that it's a super intimate medium, the
I
fact of the
agree.
matter is, yeah, part of your mechanical mind is occupied somewhere else. So
Yeah.
that's also very important to keep in mind, that you can't make it very, very complex as well. That being said, the best storytellers on podcasts do have their way of working around this. And I think it's an art. I think scripting for podcasts is extremely different from scripting for any other medium, as it should be.
Yeah.
Like, for example, one data point that often comes out is that even when Audible talks about their best-selling books, their audio best-selling audio books, then non-fiction is always doing better than fiction. And the reason behind that is that in case you're listening to something and your thoughts trail off to something happening around you or whatever, so in non-fiction you can still make sense of what is being talked about in an audio. In
Yeah,
fiction, if you lose track of something, say a page, so
yeah,
Yeah.
it's hard to link
that becomes
together.
difficult. Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So which is why
Yeah. Yeah.
non-fiction audiobooks always do better than fiction audiobooks.
Yeah, yeah, because now that you say it does make sense, because I did try listening to audiobooks, and you cannot help it, because maybe your brain needs to of its faculties to be involved in something, but if you're just
yeah.
listening, you do get distracted.
Yeah, I've
So,
recently signed two books myself with Audible. Audible is launching in India later this year, so I just signed two books
mhm,
with them. So
mhm.
Oh, that's
I
amazing.
recently, yeah, I recently listened to my own audiobooks, which was just so this is me deviating, which is something you should not do in podcasts. Me illustrating that deviation is a bad thing.
Yeah, because also I think when you deviate, you don't really have context. So for a second, you're like, what is happening?
Yeah.
Yeah, like you guys probably did right now. Yeah.
True. Okay, this question is for Sachin. Yeah, like
Yeah.
you are saying that non-fiction works better. So, on your podcast, Indian Grapevine, what type of, say, conversations do you cover, and how do you keep it? How do you keep it so that you don't deviate too much?
So unlike Chuck, my podcast was actually scripted.
Okay.
And by scripted, I don't mean it was fiction. It was all non-fiction. It was
Hmm.
me sitting with a mic and just telling a true story, something which actually happened. Okay.
Okay.
For example, my first episode was about obsolete jobs, in which I started with doing an interview of a person who was a Dastan Go. Okay, Dastan Go are oral storytellers, which is a
Yeah.
lost art form, which was discontinued somewhere in 1930s in India. So it was mostly scripted, me telling a story that this is what used to happen. I spoke to somebody who wrote a book about people who used to sell water in a bag roaming around in the streets. They would just be roaming around with a bag and selling a glass for a rupee or something like that. So I'm sorry, what was the question? I
I
just
was saying, I was saying, how do you not deviate, and how do you
yes,
still keep it
yeah,
interesting?
yeah. So my podcast was based on an American podcast called uh, This American Life. I'm sorry, yeah, it was a podcast called This American Life, in which they would pick a theme every week and do 3 or 4 stories around that theme.
Okay.
And that was the idea, that I pick a theme and do 3 or 4 stories around it. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So this is for Chuck. You have a newsletter and you have a podcast. So why did you choose to have a newsletter and a podcast? Why that difference? Why didn't you keep the newsletter as a podcast series?
Okay. Very interesting, actually. So there are a couple of things that led to the newsletter, actually. So for the newsletter is called The Third Slip,
Yeah.
and a friend who is infinitely funnier than I am, his name is Tony Sebastian. We publish it every Saturday or Sunday, depending on how the rest of the week goes. And the idea was, I actually, so when I started Simplified, I actually had this idea in mind that we break down the news with jokes and humor and whatnot, and eventually it evolved into something else, which was uh, it became about one big topic, and somewhere in me I still wanted to do this thing of taking all the news that happened in the week and breaking that down. And I realized that wouldn't work very well on a audio medium. It might work on an audio medium, but in my head, it didn't
Yeah.
make sense to have two podcasts that were somewhat similar to each other. And at the
Okay.
same time, I also wanted to get back into writing. I missed the whole, blogging days of, the
Yeah.
2010s. I always had the itch of writing something more than 140 characters, which used to be the scene back in the day. And Tony and I were both, we always used to lament that. And we had, mid-sized blogs. I wouldn't say they were super successful or something. But we always were like, yeah, dude, we should like restart a blog, but but we never got around to doing it. And then I had this idea of actually saying, okay, and at the same time, there was so much news happening at that time. We started this newsletter back in, actually last year, last April or March or April, we started it. There was so much news happening that I actually thought one way of keeping up with the news would just be to write down, bullet points of things that happen. But I thought, okay, who's going to read that? I mean, what rubbish is that? Is this going to be a diary for myself? Then I thought, okay, what if we actually make this something public facing? And what if we actually inject a little bit of humor into it? Tony jumped at the idea because it ticked off all the boxes that we wanted to do. We basically wanted to write, we wanted to keep up with the news, we wanted to just generally make fools of ourselves on another medium, and both of us jumped at a chance. And I think, and I'm very proud of the fact that we've been able to do it for next week. Tomorrow, Saturday, Sunday is going to be our 72nd issue, so we managed to do it pretty much
Wow.
every week, actually. Yeah. So
That's
we
amazing.
basically just so we basically just take all the news of the week. It's actually, once you get to the process, it's actually quite simple. And to me, the both are very, very different, because the type of humor, just like I said in the previous answer, the type of humor that you write, or even while forget humor, when you write for a podcast for an audience that's listening versus an audience that is reading, you have two
Yeah.
very different ways of operating. So even if you're doing puns, or even if you're doing jokes, the way you do it in one versus the other is very different. And many times
Yeah.
we've also been asked this question: why don't you convert your newsletter into a podcast?
Yeah.
And we realize it's a lot of effort, and both of us have day jobs, so we really can't go ahead and do that. We don't have the luxury of creating that. But at the same time, we realize the type of writing that we're doing is more suited to the audio, to the
To
visual media.
that
And when I say
medium.
visual
Yeah.
medium, I'm actually saying text over here. And I'm sure Sachin will agree with me over here. There are some things that you can write which don't translate very well into video or audio. The classic example is my favorite author of all time, P.G. Woodhouse. He's been notoriously difficult to convert into plays and audio purely
Yeah.
because so much of his I mean, it gets lost in translation, not in translation
Yeah.
from one language to the other, but from one medium to the other.
To
Like
another.
you read some of those paragraphs, and I think in the best of PG Woodhouse, Stephen Fry himself takes a paragraph. I can't recall the exact thing over here, but he just puts it out as an example and says, how does something like this, how can you actually translate this into a visual medium? So I deviated a bit from there, but basically what I was trying to say was there's a reason why we kept the third slip as a newsletter, and I think it works pretty well. I think the two serve two different types of humor, two different things that we wanted to do, and yeah, I think that's nice, really. I mean, if it turns out into a podcast later, then great, but it's not something that we have plans for immediately.
Also, I think it serves two different audiences, so
Exactly.
that's
I
also, yeah.
actually, I wouldn't say it serves two different audiences.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think at least from whatever I know and the feedback that I've got, a lot of the audiences do overlap.
Hmm.
The people who read the podcast, the people who listen to the podcast also end up listening to, reading the newsletter that we put out. So that way, a lot of the it's also because of the sensibilities, the type of
Yeah.
company that we
Type
keep
of
and
content.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah, type of content as well. Now, if we were to put out video content, I would say that the audience would be substantially different from what we have right now.
Oh, very interesting. So, Sachin, since you have a YouTube channel, do you think that would happen? That you would have a different audience in video as compared to maybe podcasting and your readers?
See, I think video is a lot more mature medium, especially after coming of Geo. I think YouTube has reached a much wider audience. Getting
Yeah.
to 1 million subscribers is like every college has a student who has a channel with 1 million subscribers right now. It's become like a very small thing. And compared to that, podcasting is still is at a very nascent stage. I believe that
Mm-hmm.
once Audible comes to India later this year, I think that will really be a landmark step
Yeah.
in podcasting as well, because they've done, like, Audible as a company has been really supportive of podcast in the US as well. If we talk
Mm-hmm.
about, say, the Serial podcast, which is the most viral podcast ever, it was sponsored by Audible. And to drive any industry, to drive creative people in any industry, you need a sponsor, you need some financial
Yeah.
backing. And
Mm-hmm. Correct.
I think by early next year or middle of next year, that is something which will come into the ecosystem. Chuck works with IBM, and that's a company I follow very closely. And they've been doing great work for last several years now, and they have, I think, tens of podcasts at this point. But the
40 at last
ecosystem,
count.
okay, but the
Yeah.
ecosystem still has a long way. I think
Yeah.
IBM has been able to operate because they've been able to build a supply chain where their costs are really low, and they've been lucky that people like Chuck have come on board for the love of podcasting and contributed content with IBM. Uh, so yeah, so to but again, I've lost track of what was the question. I think I should write down the question.
No,
Yeah,
I think,
video versus audio.
yeah.
Yeah, so video is, I think, video content became accessible to everybody when
Yeah.
YouTube became popular in India.
Yeah.
I think 2011-12 was like an inflection point for video. And I think
Mm-hmm.
2019 and 20 would hopefully be the inflection point for
Yeah.
podcast when they'll
Yeah.
reach a much wider audience.
Yeah, I just want to
Yeah.
add a couple of things to what Sachin said. Everything that he said is absolutely right, and nobody more than the podcast creating community hopes that the geo moment for podcasts is going to come, and hopefully Audible's entry into India with all of Amazon's money and Jeff Bezos's will to get things right in India. Hopefully that'll be huge. That'll be huge for us. I think one of the challenges that podcast as an industry faces is they're still very unsure of how to consume podcasts. Like
Yeah.
everybody now knows how to watch a YouTube video. Like if I say,
Hmm.
hey, say Biswa has a new video out, you say, "Oh, cool! Can you give me the YouTube link?" It's because you know what to expect. You click that, it opens up on your browser or your YouTube app. You know what the process is. Now, suppose I tell somebody I have a podcast, they say, "Okay, where can I listen to it?" Now it starts becoming difficult. Okay, you can either listen to one episode over here, which is a clunky interface, or hey, you can first download this app and then oh yeah, you need to search for me over there. Oh, then you need to subscribe to me, and then you need to download every episode, and then you need to listen to me.
I feel you. I feel
Yeah.
you, Chuck. I
Yeah.
feel you there, man. I feel we've all been through that.
Yeah, so like I and if Amit Verma, who sorry, Amit Doshi, who heads IVM podcast, were over here, he would be the first. I mean, you could have he would rant for 40 minutes just about the antiquated technology that. A podcast, and we are still stuck in RSS technology. We are still stuck in 2004 technology in 2018 when it comes to podcasts. But there are a couple of interesting developments happening over here. Google has now got an official podcast app. So
Yeah.
which means
Oh.
that hopefully it's going to come preloaded on everybody's phones. One of the reasons why podcast has taken off in the US like it has is because iPhones are a
iTunes.
dominant dominating
Yeah.
operating system over there, and the podcast app comes built in. So it's you
Yeah.
already have an app on your phone. So hopefully, and Apple being 1 to 2% of the ecosystem in India, I mean, it goes without saying that that's contributing nothing to us. So hopefully with Google Podcasts that will be interesting. But yeah, we remain optimistic about the future of podcast in India. A lot of us still do it for the love of it, obviously. But yeah, you can sense that some changes are around the corner. More and more people are listening. More and more people are comfortable with the idea of downloading a separate app just to listen to this. And actually, interfaces are getting better in the sense, even if I don't want to download an app, it becomes as seamless as a YouTube video. So I can say, hey, Chuck's new podcast is out. Oh, very cool. Can you give me the link? Click that, and it opens up on a still clunky but manageable browser or a audio player online. So technologically, there are a few things that are heading us in the right direction, I think.
I think
Yeah.
also
It's yeah.
also just one point that I think an important inflection point for podcast internationally was also the serial podcast.
Yeah,
I mean, if you look at the numbers, it got 100 million downloads.
yeah,
100 million, 10 crore. That's some serious numbers.
yeah,
I
Yeah.
think another benchmark, another milestone moment will also be that when India gets that level of viral podcast, which happens in India,
yeah.
which I think it will take a few years,
Yeah,
but
I
when
think it
that happens,
also,
that
yeah, correct. And I think India is a very personality driven market. As much as we hipsters would like to keep podcasts in the so called woke people space, I have a feeling it is going to take something like a Shah Rukh Khan or somebody of that stature to
we
have
already
their
have
own podcast.
we already have Neha Dhruv here, but
Yeah.
uh,
So,
Neha Dhruv is doing
and
a podcast.
yeah, and IVM itself has a show with Cyrus Brocha, which
Yeah.
is the biggest show on the network. So, yeah, I think it's going to. It needs a big name. It needs a Virat Kohli. It needs an official Indian cricket podcast. It needs a Shah Rukh Khan. I mean, we may just laugh about it right now, but I think the ecosystem needs something like that. Like it took an AIB to create these videos for people to realize that comedy on video is a sustainable career, for instance. Only
Yeah.
after
Yeah.
that did all the sketches and stuff happen. So I think it's just a matter of something
So
like that coming.
one inside info on that, Chuck, is that Amazon's first set of audiobooks that will come with Audible, some of them will be voiced by Bollywood A-listers.
Incredible.
So, yeah, and when I say
Wow.
A-lister, it really means A-listers. And
Wow, that
These are
sounds great.
which is
massive.
something,
These are massive business scoops that we're getting on the show here.
yeah, and which
I
is something,
know.
yeah, which is something they've done in the West. That is, like they have had Hollywood A-listers
Yeah,
voice audiobooks
yeah,
in the
yeah,
US.
yeah.
So again, I think November this year might be a big step for the audio industry in India.
Very
Yeah.
impressive. Looking forward
So
to it.
time to look out for is November.
Yeah.
Yeah.
4th
Okay,
November.
so
4th November, it will be.
excellent. We should keep something on 4th November for our little FB chatter also. Let's see once that is done. Okay, so I'm done with my questions. Let's see if
Oh,
the audience has any questions. Oh, we have one. I don't know if you guys can see it. It says, "Can podcasts be monetized?"
yeah, I can see it, but I'm trying my best to ignore it.
Why is that?
Okay, I think the best person to answer this would be Amit Doshi, who heads IVM podcast, and I would implore him to leave an answer in this Facebook Live so that people who see it later can get his viewpoints on this. In short, yes, podcast can definitely be monetized. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a thriving industry in the US. I think organizations such as Gimlet Media and NPR and Stitcher have made a fantastic business out of podcasts, out of making and selling podcasts, importantly. It's a matter of time before it happens in India as well. Because I think everything that we spoke about, the industry maturing, people listening, etc., it's all it's all leading in that direction. One problem in India right now is because podcasts are still facing the classic new medium problem. Like who has the money? It's brands.
Yeah.
Brands don't know enough about this new medium, and they're not seeing the value in investing in it yet. So if you talk about podcasts, the numbers, I mean, we have a loyal audience, but we don't have earth-shattering numbers. And these are very
Right.
busy media managers who are used to listening to numbers like, okay, I'm going to get 1 million views, 1 million
Yeah.
clicks. I mean, it's
Yeah.
India. That's a drop in the ocean for, I mean, anything you do, you will get into a million very easily. So when you
Yeah.
say, hey, I have very dedicated listenership, but only like 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 a month. They're like, hey, we don't want that. I mean, they operate on impressions. They don't operate so much on stickiness, etc. And this is the same problem. So before I got into Insider, I was working in digital ad agencies throughout my career for about a decade. And I've seen this evolution happen where people used to even question the value of advertising on Facebook or YouTube.
Hmm.
Compare that now, where pretty much 30, 40, if not more, percent of any brand's budget will be on digital. So it's just a
Yeah.
matter of time before podcasts also. I mean, it's not just about the numbers on a medium like podcast. People will say, okay, if I want to target people who are uh, listening in, who are very clued in and are of a certain type of lifestyle, then podcast is probably where I need to go, even if I'm not going to get the 1 million, 2 million, 3 million type numbers. And I'm not exaggerating here, because even the most famous podcasts in the world, I think Micros, the way I heard it, is a fantastic podcast. It's just about, and he says his best episodes have 5 to 7 million views. Now that seems like a big number, but then you compare it to the average AIB video, which has easily 4 to 5 million. And you're like,
Yeah.
is that all that this medium can deliver? But then you also realize it's not just about the numbers, it's about the time that they're spending. And the smartest podcast advertising is not just an ad in the middle of content. And I think that's something that's very important about advertising in podcasts. I think the best type of advertising in podcasts actually manages to weave and I'm not talking about product placement over here. I think the style of the podcast narrator actually comes out in the ad. Two examples that I can give right away. For those who are into startups, there's this fantastic podcast by Reid Hoffman, who created PayPal and LinkedIn, along with a bunch of other names. He one of his principal sponsors is a company called ZipRecruiter, which helps companies recruit people. And he doesn't just say, hey, our sponsor is ZipRecruiter and you should go with them because 1, 2, 3. He actually interviews the founder of ZipRecruiter and asks him questions that seem like a logical extension of the podcast itself. And I think
Hmm.
that's very cool. On the other hand, another podcast I listen to is a English words based podcast by this English author called Helen Zaltzman, who is the sister of Andy Zaltzman, who runs the Bugle, which is probably my favorite podcast in the world. She does something very interesting. Since her show is all about words and the etymology of language, she ends her show with a random word sponsored by a certain company. So she said today's
Oh.
word of the day is brought to you by X brand, and she just flips through a dictionary and then points to one word and gives the etymology of that. I think that's, it's so beautifully, and it's content. You don't feel like it's an ad, and I think
Yeah.
that sort of maturity to create content that is specific for a medium is yet to arrive in India fully. And we already know this. Like, for example, the worst thing you can do on YouTube is to put your television commercial over there. The best YouTube ads are things that are made for the digital medium. Like when you
Yeah.
watch a YouTube
Yeah.
video, and when you see a nice 30-second video before that, you're going to skip it. Like it's human nature to want to sort of install an ad blocker or something. Now brand managers have finally realized that, okay, we need to make 6-second videos for these guys, otherwise nobody's going to see our ads. So look at how it's evolved. So that's the same thing
Yeah.
that's going to happen to podcasts. So there's a maturity on the knowledge front and a creative development front as well that needs to happen, and it will happen with time, or so we hope. Sorry,
Great.
that's a long monologue from me.
Yeah, very,
No.
very close to your heart. This topic seems very.
Yeah. No, you are a marketing professional, so Divya says hi to Deepak.
Hi, she's my wife, so she better.
That's a very interesting question, actually.
Which is?
Okay, you can't
Oh,
say a dream guest
yeah.
you'd like to get on the podcast.
Oh, wow. There are so many actually. Sachin, I'm going to let you take that one while I think about it. Actually, this is a very, very interesting question.
Yeah.
Uh,
So,
it's a very. I think it'll be a bit unexpected, but I really wanted to interview Ramchandra Guha because I've read his books for a long time, and I think I just have like tens of questions. So if Mr. Guha is watching it, I'd love to. If he's watching this video, I'd love to have you on this show. Or if somebody knows him, then pass on the word, please. What about you, Chuck?
Yeah, I'm honestly, I'm still thinking because while there are a lot of people who I'd like to personally speak to, like I mean, I can think of 100 different rock stars that I'd love to sit down and have a chat about. The aim of our podcast is really to simplify things, as I like to say. So something actually Paul McCartney would be a brilliant guest. I don't think anybody would be more knowledgeable about the music industry than he would be. Like he was there from the birth of it, he was one of the biggest superstars of it, he was a producer, and I don't think anyone would be able to talk about the music world better than him. So yeah, Paul, if you are listening to this by any chance, our studio is in car and we record on Tuesdays if you're free.
What if he's free on a Wednesday, Chuck? Then what do you do?
We'll have to make time. We'll have to make time.
then maybe he can take an appointment with you.
Yeah, I'm imagining now just like the famous scenes at Shea Stadium in Chicago in 1964 with all those girls screaming. I'm just imagining Car Road Station going nuts because Paul McCartney is walking out. So yeah, there you go.
I don't think the station will be a very safe place for him to be at.
Yeah, the station's hardly a safe place anyway.
That's true. That's also true. Okay. Oh, there's one more person who wants to say hi to Deepak.
Yeah, that must be Sriket, and that's my co-host
Ah,
on the
yes.
podcast trying to troll me, so I'm going to ignore that.
Okay, great. Oh, this is the first time we are getting troll messages on our FB chatter. Excellent. Such
This one
great
happens to the risk
news.
that I told you there was a certain risk associated with getting me on the show.
No, not at all. Okay, so well, we have actually quite exceeded our 30 minutes. We've almost been talking for 50 minutes now.
Yeah, that happens very regularly on our show as well. If Abbas, our producer, is listening to this, he will totally empathize with you. At the end of every show, he just holds his head in his hand and is like, how the hell am I going to reduce this down to 30 minutes? Is usually his problem. But hey, that's
No,
IBM signed up for that.
No, we are very happy with this. So let's just Yes, I think this is a good place to wrap up on that troll message
Yeah.
and on the message. Thank you so
Amazing.
much, Chuck, and thank you so much, Sachin, for joining
Yeah.
us and sharing all your experiences. And it was great to have you.
My pleasure, and Sachin, thank you so much for the news of Audible coming to India. It's something it's one of those things that I Google at an almost weekly basis. Audible India
It's
launch date, and
it's
uh,
actually in public domain. They made a proper announcement about October. Then I
yeah,
was
but
talking to
nothing's yeah, and I was just expecting them to launch it on Prime Day, so I just
oh,
kept I was in Sri Lanka at the time, so I just kept logging in, like, are they launching? Are they announcing? But this is amazing news. I'm really looking forward to this.
yeah. So
Excellent.
thank you, Suchita. Yeah,
Thank
great to
you.
be here.
Thank
Yeah,
Yeah.
Thank
yeah.
you, everyone. And thank you, all of you, for tuning in. Good night. And we'll be back next Friday with somebody else.
See you guys.
Thank you.
Good
Bye.
night.
Bye.
Bye.